Hello again, Honors 410 students. So for this class, I'm going to be focusing on talking about our workshop drafts and a little bit about feedback that we give in the workshop process itself. So there's no reading assigned for today, so no reading response journals. I am going to ask a couple open-ended questions I would still like to have people respond to in the discussion thread here for today. This will also be a good discussion thread if you have questions about what's expected of you for the workshop draft or what the workshop is going to look like. This is a good time for us to discuss all of that as well. For our next class on the 13th, so for that class, I'm going to post a short piece for us to do kind of a practice workshop around, so that the meat of our discussion will be around that. Additionally, as a reminder for those students who are up to submit their workshop drafts on the 13th, that due date is coming up soon, right? So it's now less than a week away. So please do make sure you have those to me no later than what would have been the start of our class time at 1 p.m. on that Monday. If you can get them to me sooner, I really appreciate it, because if you do that, then I'm able to go ahead and post them to the class in the morning, and that kind of helps everything just sort of, move along from there. So just as a reminder or clarifier, the way that will work is students who have work will turn it in by what would have been the start of class time on the date that they're signed up for. Once I have them, I have the opportunity to do so, I will post them. My plan as of now is to post them as readings, so in the files section, not in a discussion thread. The reason I'm doing it that way is that if I do it on a discussion thread, I think that creates the temptation for us all to weigh in and start discussing the pieces right there. Whereas really what we're intending to do is to post the pieces for you to be able to read them, essentially as homework for the next class session and write your workshop letters. And then we'll spend that next discussion thread actually talking about the pieces and doing some critique, commenting on what's working and what's not working so well, and so on and so forth. So again, my plan will be, and I'll go over this, I'm sure a number of times as we go along here, but my plan will be you submit the pieces to me, I get them up in the files section for students to be able to read them. Students read them, and in the next class session, we're discussing them as a group there. This whole online format for us is a little unusual. It's different with what I'm used to for writing workshop, but I actually think this should work out pretty well, especially once we kind of get into the rhythm of doing it this way. Although, as always, I encourage you to give me feedback if it's not working so well for you, or if it feels more confusing than helpful at certain points. But to talk about a few pieces here, I want to talk about just kind of general things that I tend to see in student writing, especially creative writing, and let you kind of digest some of this and take it into consideration as you're hopefully all starting to work on your workshop drafts. Maybe for some of you are a little ways into it now. Just some general kind of things I tend to see be pitfalls of student work, and things I'd like to keep in mind. These are things we're probably going to revisit when we get to the workshop discussion itself, because even if we are trying to address these things or keep them in mind, still, even for very, very polished advanced writers, still this stuff tends to come up to at least some degree. So when you're working on your workshop drafts, one big thing I want to suggest is a focus on scene. So rather than kind of giving us blanket summary of moments or exposition of background information or that sort of thing, more often than not, when you can get right to the scene of something actually happening, capturing the action of what people are doing, interacting with each other, the dialogue of what they're saying, those sorts of things. It allows for a lot more of kind of the show don't tell dynamic, where you kind of demonstrate that things are a certain way. So for example, rather than just telling us that this character had a really bad temper and was angry all the time, actually showing a scene where this character is getting worked up over something that seems pretty minor, and and then lashes out maybe in terms of what they say or what they do, allows the reader to kind of connect those dots for us, and allows you to a little bit more artfully demonstrate what's happening as opposed to just telling us it's happening. So trying to focus on scene, for these workshop drafts, they're 4 to 6 pages. As a general rule of thumb, if you've gone more than a page without a scene, but both the beginning and then even throughout the piece, that's usually not a great sign, right? There are certainly exceptions to that, but generally you want to make sure you're capturing some scenes, and a lot of times that you'll interweave short scenes with some exposition or internal thoughts of a character, and that's perfectly fine. That's certainly a part of writing and a part of writing scenes, but erring towards capturing some elements of scene on a consistent basis. Related thought, don't focus too much on exposition, especially at the very beginning of the story. It's a fairly common thing that writers will just sort of write all the background we need to know about a character and then get into the story. Some level of exposition is often necessary, right? Because there are times where we just won't be able to follow what's happening without any exposition whatsoever. But if you start to kind of laying out the whole backstory of who this character is or what this setting is, especially in a piece this short, 4 to 6 pages, it can pretty quickly overwhelm the piece, and you don't actually have time to tell a story after that. So looking for opportunities to weave that exposition in, to have it happen within the action of the story, or sometimes within dialogue can be an appropriate place for it. The reason I hesitate when I say that is expository dialogue can kind of be its own trap, where characters are kind of saying things too overtly in a way that it doesn't sound like a natural conversation, but rather as though they're just giving us kind of plot points when they talk. So, being wary of that dynamic, but kind of using all the tools at your disposal, right? Where can you weave in exposition? Where can a quick bit of dialogue open up some internal thoughts for the narrator to reveal some exposition? That sort of thing. And when you do turn to dialogue, making it count. I think a lot of times it's temptation to sort of use it as filler. For those of you who a 4 to 6 page length is a little bit more daunting, well, if I just have quick lines of dialogue and they alternate by each paragraph, that'll pretty quickly kill a couple pages. That's not to say that you can't have dialogue that uses a lot of page space, but make it count, make it useful to the story. Don't just use it kind of for filler purposes. It's a common misconception that dialogue should sound exactly like people talk. That's not to say that it should sound unnatural, and I think it often is a good barometer to whether it sounds sort of like something someone could say. But when we focus too much on capturing dialogue exactly the way people speak, the issue that can come up is that people tend, well, as I just demonstrated, to say a lot, right? Or to say or to have other kind of little pauses and interjections like that don't really add anything to a story, that occasionally can be useful in terms of communicating that someone is hesitating or is nervous or something along those lines. But usually it tends to just bog down the story a little bit more and not really share as much, as it just kind of kills page space and doesn't really reveal anything super meaningful about character. If you ever were to just transcribe two people actually talking, you might be shocked by how many interjections like and that you actually hear. And similarly, people tend to speak in cliches, right? Where we just kind of say, it is the way it is, or, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. And again, if that's a character trait where you're trying to emphasize they kind of speak in that kind of language, that can be valid, that can work. But if you're trying to just kind of capture, real dialogue, the way people speak, a lot of times that's a trap that will actually kind of weaken your writing, because you're kind of falling into the same traps that people do when they're speaking. So just things to be mindful of when you are writing dialogue. And again, I've talked about this in the past, but similar to our flash pieces, the objective here is to write a complete story. And so we will all acknowledge this is a rough draft, and there'll definitely be opportunities to expand it in your final version that you'll ultimately turn into me. But for this one, aiming to have an ending. And it might not be the ending you end up going with for your revised draft, but do try to have some form of ending there, not just kind of a ... to be continued, or just kind of leaving it because you've already hit your 4-page mark. Try to resolve your story to the extent that you can. So those are just some real general points, again, are kind of relatively common things I see come up in student writing. By no means an exhaustive list. But I am really looking forward to seeing what you all come up with. But by way of making this a discussion and giving you a chance to participate in the discussion thread here, the question I want to pose to you is what you like when you're reading work, whether it's literature or more kind of pop kind of literature, whatever it might be. What engages you, what keeps you reading, and also what turns you off. Because a lot of times taking that as sort of a litmus test, I imagine we're going to have a fair amount of overlap in the kinds of things that we all like and the kinds of things that most of us don't like. And holding your own work to those same standards can be a really useful exercise just to see if it's working on at least that level. Okay, so to comment briefly, we're going to do a practice workshop coming up in class, as I've alluded to. In terms of the workshop structure, usually if it's an in-person conversation, the way I kind of frame it is we start with just focusing on positives, similar to what we did for our flash fiction pieces, and then we'll adjust the conversation to talk about potential areas for improvement or areas to expand, or things that just don't quite make sense to us yet in the draft. And so because of the written structure of this workshop, it all being online, those parts of the conversation are kind of give and flow, into each other. I'm going to encourage people when they're giving their responses in the discussion thread to restrict it to just kind of a singular comment, right? So as opposed to just kind of giving all of your feedback for the piece all in one, that makes it really hard for it to become a discussion where people are kind of going back and forth. So trying to pose, even if you have to post, 3 or 4 times, like what is one thing that you really like here that's really connecting with you? What is one thing that's a question or, again, a point where you think it could be improved within the story, and so on and so forth. And feel free to post as many times as you like within that. The online discussion will not necessarily capture everything that you had in your workshop letters. Kind of the spirit of a traditional workshop is that the workshop letters help you process your thoughts in advance, and then you're ready to come to the live discussion and weigh in with some of those thoughts, and you might change your mind about some things after you hear the full class discussion. It's a little different with the online format, but again, there will certainly be some overlap between what you put in your workshop letters and what you say in the discussion thread. Don't feel like you have to say everything in both places, I guess is what I'm trying to get at there. This probably goes without saying, but especially again in this written format where we can't necessarily read the room quite as well or see how the author is reacting, I want to be really careful to be respectful and be careful with each other's work. Recognize that just reading a bunch of really mean comments about your work doesn't feel good to anyone, right? But by the same token, also still being critical, right? So holding yourselves kind of accountable. This is supposed to be a forum when we get to the workshop for both again kind of positive encouragement as well as critical feedback. So being honest and kind of entertaining both sides of that discussion, I think, will be pretty important. Where possible, being specific, referencing specific page numbers or specific quotes from the piece is really useful. I mean, a lot of times we give just kind of general feedback where it's like, this piece just seemed kind of confusing to me, right? That's not so helpful to the author unless really just the entire piece was sort of inscrutable. But if you say, on page 3, the second paragraph, I had a really hard time following the dialogue here. I wasn't sure who was speaking or why they were saying that. That helps pinpoint what's going on and kind of point the author specifically to where you're looking. Let's see, and these comments, they can be on a prose level. So for example, that a certain sentence is really, just kind of, a run-on sentence or is difficult to make sense of or has missing kind of words that just, mean that it doesn't quite of add up. But please don't limit yourself to just mechanical edits, right? There is some space for that, especially if it has a significant impact on your understanding of the reading. But the spirit of this is more kind of we're looking at content of a piece as opposed to, fixing someone's spelling or punctuation, that sort of thing. And then in terms of things that you should be considering, and this goes for both the workshop discussion as well as your workshop letters, thinking about character, thinking about setting, thinking about plot, thinking about comprehension. If or when or where you may have gotten lost on something, that can be useful. Thinking about the voice that's being used and if it's consistent, thinking about kind of the tone of the piece and how that's adding or perhaps detracting from the piece. All of that can be worthwhile for us to discuss. To round out our discussion thread here, I'll pose one more open-ended question for folks to weigh in on. And this is more broad, because I realize for many of you, I expect this is probably your first writing workshop kind of experience. And so you can talk about writing, but you also talk kind of about all sorts of other things with this question. I'm going to ask for you to discuss a time when feedback was useful to you. So what makes feedback useful in terms of how it's delivered, in terms of the content of it, and on the flip side of that, when is feedback not so useful or even counterproductive? So I think most of us have had that experience as well. So again, this can be about your writing or more academic things, but you can also kind of think about this more broadly in terms of past work experience, or if you played a sport, in terms of how you were coached, in terms of in your family life, how you've interacted with, you know, parents or siblings or guardians, or elders, or you know, or perhaps even how you've kind of given other people feedback. All this is kind of fair game. Just because I think when we think about a writing workshop, it can sound sort of singular to this experience, when really I think it does map onto a lot of other experiences we have in our personal and professional lives. That's actually part of why I think it's a good model. And so I want to kind of an open discussion about, again, kind of feedback and when it's useful and why, and when it's not useful or, again, even counterproductive, and why that's the case. So, okay, I look forward to hearing what you all have to say, and I will see you next time.